Yo, what up? How's it going? And welcome back for another video. In today's video, I'll be showing you guys all of the synergies, all the traits, classes, origins, and TFT set 6. And I'll be kind of guiding you guys through how each synergy works and so what are some of the best pairings and stuff like that. At least preliminary. I'm making this at launch of TFT set 6. So some things could change, but I played a lot of the PBE. I think I have a really good understanding of this. And if you're a new player, or if you didn't have time to play PBE, or you're just getting into set 6 if you're watching this later, this will be a good resource to see what synergies and traits naturally kind of work together. That is my goal for this video. What I will not be talking about is balance of these things, because this is all subject to change. Balance changes constantly from patch to patch. And as I'm making this video, there is a patch going through. So balance is not that important. Other than I will talk about a few things of like, some of these chase traits, when are they a little bit diminishing returns, at least in their current iteration. But I will not be talking about power in the meta, just how they work. So let's just get right into it. All right, Arcanist. Okay, allies have increased spell power. At 2 Arcanist, it is 20% ability power for your whole team, kind of like Dusk if you played set 4. Okay, at 4, it's Arcanist gain more AP, just the Arcanist. And then at 6, all allies gain a certain amount of AP, and Arcanist gain a double amount, it looks like. And then at level 8, all allies gain a huge amount of AP, at least in the current iteration. So it's not specific to Arcanist at that point once you hit 8. Okay, and then just looking at the units, it's Lux, Malzahar, Swain, Twisted Fate, Vex, Victor, and Ziggs. Okay, just so preliminary, what I'm going to say about this, it's typically not worth chasing for 8, because if you chase for 8, you're having to run a bunch of terrible units like Ziggs and, TF late game, Ziggs, TF, Swain late game, unless you're carrying one of them. And you end up just having a lot of useless units when there's a lot of like really, really strong units for late game, like a lot of the enchanters, the bodyguards, stuff like that are very strong units. So typically chasing for an 8 chase trait is not that great, even though it looks kind of cool, unless they change how the synergy works, and maybe it's worth it. Obviously, there's niche areas where you get augments and it'll be worth it, but that's going to apply to everything here, so that's probably going to be the last time I say that. Okay, so some things that pair really well with this. If you're playing Malzahar carry, pairing mutants with it, obviously, that's pretty obvious, pairs really well. I'm sure there's going to be a patch where you pair a lot of academics, or if you have an academic emblem, then you can easily fit in a Leona and a Yuumi, and you can play around academics. You're playing Lux carry. If you're playing around Victor carry, if you're playing around Victor carry, you probably just have a lot of legendaries. So just playing around legendaries are good, but obviously you can play around Chemtech. There's TF. So I love playing TF carry personally. You can play around syndicates. You can play like a reroll build with bodyguards and syndicates, and then Ziggs right here. So typically how I play Arcanist is I just play around Arcanist early game. I can stretch it out to 6, and then usually late game you drop some of your Arcanists that you're not carrying for better units like enchanters and bodyguards and legendary units. So just Arcanist is a really big synergy, so you typically just play around Arcanist for most of the game, and then you add better units later in the game. Okay, Assassin. Okay, so Assassins do what they've always done. They have an innate, they jump to the backline. Their abilities can critically strike once you have the trait active. And they gain a bonus critical strike damage and critical strike damage. And this just scales up the damage and chance at each interval. So that's all you really need to know. Okay, we have Akali, Echo, Katarina, Shaco, Talon, and Twitch. Depending on balance, all of these can actually carry except for Echo. Echo is he is the utility unit in this build. All of these other units, kind of weird. All the other assassins are all damage carries, which I like because I hated having Diana and Viego in the game. It's so annoying because every comp runs assassins. It's so frustrating. So now every single unit is basically a carry except for Echo. I'm sure there'll be a patch where Echo can carry, but mostly he's just a side carry and the utility carry of the comp if you're playing it. Typically when you play Sins, you want to just play around Sins. So you play around 2, 4, and 6 Sins, especially if you have emblems. 6 Sins can be a really nice spike, and that's all good. If you're playing Talon, you have to play around Imperials. For the most part, if you're going to play Talon carry, I personally don't like playing Imperials. I think unless you have emblems, then it's very good. If you want to play Twitch, I'm sure there's going to be a Twitch reroll build out there someday, or maybe it's active. It was at the beginning of PBE. Play around Chemtech, Katarina. Very easy if you have an emblem to play around like bodyguards with Katarina carry, and you can play like Yuumi Leona, Katarina with an emblem. Very easy to get for academics. Very nice. Cool. And Akali and Shaco, you're obviously going to play around Syndicate. 7 Syndicate and 5 Syndicate are really nice spikes, at least at the time you're making this video. So if you're going to play one of these carries, you typically play around like a TF Darius early game, and then you pivot into an Akali Shaco. It can be very nice to build a comp around. Cool. All right, Bodyguard. Now we're going to get into some of the synergies where we're going to have a little bit more of talking about how they interact in compositions, because a lot of the like Assassins and Arcanists, just like, well, you're playing Assassins and Arcanists, so you're playing those, and you kind of just add based off the carry you're playing. But now these are the ones that are splashable. Okay, Bodyguards have increased armor, so it's like Vanguards. Shortly after combat begins, Bodyguards taunt adjacent enemies, so they actually have a taunt like they have a ZZ Rot portal. It's pretty cool. All right, cool, and it's just at 2 intervals. You gain armor throughout the intervals. Cool. So typically you just play two or 4 Bodyguards in your comp, and then if you have an emblem, you can flex to a 6, or if you have or if you're at the end of the game and it's just a bunch of AD players or AD focused meta, then I could see a world where 6 Bodyguard could be meta, but typically you're gonna play around 4 and 2 for the most part. All right, we have Blitzcrank, Brom, Darius, Galio, Leona, and Poppy. So Darius and Poppy are your early game Bodyguards. Very easy to fit them in. I do love playing around them. Playing around them with Arcanist is very good early game, because you can get kind of like a Syndicate, Yordle, Arcanist, Scholar build going. It's one of my favorite early games to play out. And so when you're playing Darius and Poppy, you play around Syndicate and Yordles in the early game. Can be very nice. There's other ways you can play them, but that's a good way that I found to play them. And then you can stack Darius or you can stack Poppy, and then you just transition out of Darius and Poppy to Brom Leona, or Brom Blitzcrank, or Brom Galio, just depending on what makes sense for your comp. Cool. So some of the late game carries that utilize these comps pretty well, or utilize Bodyguards pretty well, are going to be Jhin. I might miss some, but like Jhin uses Bodyguards really well because Bodyguards provide a lot of stall and CC. They pair very well with Enchanters because Enchanters give them the magic resist. And it gives them the magic resist. Pairs really well with Syndicates. So as you can see, there's 2 Syndicates here. So if you're playing around Akali and stuff like that, then Bodyguards are going to pair very well with them. You can pair Bodyguards with any carry you want, but yeah, the best ones that utilize them to me are going to be if you're playing around Jhin or Snipers, or you're playing around like an academic like Lux. Or if you're playing around Challengers, very important. Challengers, Snipers, Arcanist, and Yordles and Syndicates are going to be the comps that utilize them the best. But obviously, you can fit Bodyguards pretty much anywhere. All right, Bruisers. All right, Bruisers, all allies gain health, and Bruisers gain double the bonus. It's just at 2 unit intervals. We have Cho'gath, Mundo, Alawi, Tom Kinch, Trundle, Bai, and Zach. Okay. In the early game, your Bodyguards, or not Bodyguards, your early game Bruisers are going to be Alawi, Trundle, and Vi, and then to a lesser degree, Zach and Cho'gath. Okay, in the early game, you can play around Mercenaries with Alawi if you end up getting like a Mercenary emblem, or you're hitting Mercenaries, and you can play around them, but that's purely just for econ. That's not really like board strength. But you can also play around scraps like Ezreal, Echo, and Ziggs. You can play around in the early game with Trundle, and you can play like a Trundle early game carry, something like that. And occasionally there'll be a Trundle reroll build on the PBE. There is one, but he did just get nerfed. Another good build to play around in the early game is around Snipers. You can play Caitlyn plus Kog'Maw whenever you get Kog'Maw, and you can decide from there. And so you get Enforcer from Vi. You can decide from there whether you just want to play around Caitlyn, then transition into a Jhin comp. The only difficult thing about transitioning the Jhin is that typically you want to get out of Bruisers into Bodyguard, so you will have to do a full board flip with your front line. That's not too hard to do, but just know that you will have to flip your front line instead of just a natural progression to another front line. But also, if you're playing on Kog'Maw and you end up having a good mutation, then it's really easy to pivot into mutants and to play around mutants for the rest of the game. Maybe pivot into a Kaisa, maybe pivot into a Kaisa, maybe pivot into a Cho'gath. Pivot into a Urgot. I always get Cho'gath and Urgot mixed up by name. I don't know how. But anyway, so typically when you play these, you want to play around mutants, play around Enforcer, play around Snipers in the early game, and play around Chemtechs can be very, very, very strong. And then late game carries that work best with this are Kai'Sa, Jinx, Kai'Sa, Jinx, Urgot, and then if you're still want to play Kog'Maw, you can. So those are some of the best carries, but you know, you could play Jhin with that if you wanted to. I have before, but it's just not quite as good typically. Okay, challengers have increased attack speed upon landing a takedown on their target. Challengers will dash to a new target, doubling this bonus for 2.5 seconds. So challengers gain an increased attack speed, and then upon taking a takedown, they will gain double attack speed and dash, similar to Cavalier, except for they actually have to get a takedown, and it's attack speed, not damage reduction like Cavalier. Okay, so it's at 2 unit intervals. We got Camille, Fiora, Kai'Sa, Quinn, Samira, Warwick, and Yone. All right, in the early game, your early game ones are going to be Camille, Quinn, Samira, and Warwick. You know, Samira to a less degree. Cool. So Camille is really great to play around. She has a frontline. She has a tank. She can do decent damage in the early game as well. It's really easy to pair her with, obviously, another challenger like Warwick. It's very easy to pair her with innovators because she has a Clockwork, and Zillion is a Clockwork. So very good to pair her with innovators and other challengers. She's decent to pair in a mercenary build for the early game. Maybe you can transition into having Warwick. Any type of mercenary reroll build. If you're rerolling, you want to play Quinn as like a side carry, you can also reroll for Warwick. So that's something that's very interesting to do. A lot of this stuff is meta dependent, but I'm just hitting you guys up with some of the early game tech. So I like playing around Camille with Clockworks and innovators if I have the option. And I also like to play around Camille and Warwick and mercenaries and kind of flex around that and maybe add some Chemtechs. Kind of figure out whoever you're hitting, you can play around that carry. Obviously, Samira you can hit if you have Imperial augments or you hit the Imperials. Samira can be a very good early and mid game carry. She's kind of like Kindred from set 4. You can just plug and play her in. Deals a lot of damage. Can carry your mid game and early game pretty well. But I personally am not a huge fan of playing around Imperials. I think it's just way too hard to fit without emblems and augments. Cool. And then late game, unless you reroll to Warwick or one of these guys, late game, you can pair around Kai'Sa with mutants and bruisers, like I just said before. Also, you can just play Fiora and Yone, pair them with bodyguards and academics, are very strong, like Leona, like Yuumi. But also, pairing them with Jace is very, very good because Fiora is an enforcer and Jace is just a very strong unit. He's a legendary. Also, the other thing you pair them with is innovators because it's really easy to run an innovator opener with Camille and then transition that into a Fiora Yone, add a Jace, and now you have innovators and enforcer and challengers, and now you have the 4 cost versus the 1 and 2 cost. So you can just use like an innovator build to pivot into this. But also, again, you can just play like enchanters plus bodyguards plus academics, play like a Yone carry, and then splash in a Jace to get enforcer because Jace is a strong unit. So be thinking about that. All right, Colossus. Colossus is a very unique trait. Colossus are bigger, more powerful, and take up 2 slots in your army. So it's like a reverse force of nature. You lose a spot on your army if you're playing a Colossus. So we got Cho'gath, Galio, and Scion. Colossus are immune to crowd control effects, and then at 2, Colossus take 25% reduced damage. So it's just a 1-to-1 thing here. Okay, so Cho'gath is your early game one. This highly depends on balance, and I would love to talk about mutation, but we'll get to mutation in a minute. This highly depends on balance whether you can play Cho'gath, because he doesn't really do a lot. He just bites somebody. And so unless you're stacking him or building a whole comp around him, he doesn't really do much, and he takes up 2 spots on your team. So he really depends, if you're going to play around Cho'gath, on the mutation and whether you get him early. The only time I ever touch Cho'gath, but this is highly subject to balance, is if I get him very early and the mutation is beneficial for Cho'gath. That's the only time I'll play that champ. Cool, and we got Galio and Scion over here. So Scion is a protector and Imperial, so he's going to be very strong if you want to run an Imperial comp, right? So if you're carrying a Samira or a Talon or something like that, he's going to be your frontliner. Also, if you just look at me hovering him, you see all the damage items. There's going to be patches where he's very good as a DPS and paired with Socialites with Galio to get this damage reduction, and as well to get the Socialite buff. So if you have a Socialite Hex that is beneficial to playing a Scion, and Scion carry is in meta, you can just play Imperials plus Socialites plus Enchanters and just play a Scion carry. Can be very strong. You just build full damage and you have your whole team heal him and keep him alive. Galio is a very good splash as a really solid frontliner. And in my champion or my unit guide video, I'll just say this again: be very careful running a Galio as a solo frontliner, because he will de-aggro, and you can mess up his stuff if he's a solo frontliner. So just know. Cool, yeah. So pair them with Imperials, pair them with other bodyguards, and you can splash this in as a Socialite trait. Play around Cho'gath if it makes sense for the game, but that is highly subject to balance and to what mutation you have. Enchanters. Healing and shielding are stronger, and all allies gain increased magic resistance. So this is the magic resist gaining trait. It's like Mystics. Cool. All right, it's at 2, 3, 4, and 5. So you just have to have 2 active to get it. And then after that, it's at 1 unit intervals, which is very great. I love it. Cool. We got Janna, Lulu, Orianna, and Taric. At the time we make this video, Janna and Orianna fit in literally every single comp, and except for like a 7 unit synergy comp. And Taric fits in most comps as well. Basically, all these units are just going to be splashable. They just splash in every single comp. There's really not really much more you need to know about that. I mean, you play Lulu when you're probably playing Yordles, or if you need to splash in Lulu for extra magic resist, I'm sure there'll be a patch where that makes sense. You splash in a Taric whenever you want Socialite. If the Socialite Hex is very good for you, or you need more enchanters, he's a very good frontliner as well. Yeah, at 3-star, he's a crazy tanky frontliner, but just at 2-star, he's a very solid unit to just splash into any comp if the Socialite Hex makes sense for you. And then Orianna, very good paired with Jhin specifically, but it's just going to be good pretty much in every comp. I mean, it's so easy to splash her in. Janna, same deal. So easy to splash her in. And then Lulu, you play with Yordles. That's pretty much it on that one. Okay, Innovators. Innovators, you build a mechanical companion to join their battle. This is like the Cultist trait, or like Mech, you know, like this is like that trait if you played previous sets. I don't know why I can't think of the set 5 one. I've wiped set 5 from my memory. Sorry, guys. Cool. All right, 3, you get a mechanical Scarab, so little spider looking thing. Mechanical Bear, you get Tibbers. And then at 7, you get the Hextech Dragon. Cool deal. So there's Ezreal, Heimerdinger, Jace, Seraphine, Singed, and Zillion. So just like I talked about before, in the early game, you can play around like a Camille with Ezreal, Zillion, and Singed or something like that. You can play around Challengers and Chemtechs with Singed, 2 Innovators plus, like Singed plus an Innovator. Oh, it's really Singed plus Zillion plus Heimerdinger. And then you can play, it's a really neat comp. You can play around having Challengers with Camille and Warwick, and then you add a Lysandra and you get Scholar. So you'll have Scholar, Chemtech, Challenger, Innovator. Very cool. And Clockwork. Very cool thing to play around. And you can just transition that into Chemtech, transition that into Challengers, just like I talked about before. And then, yeah, or just keep running Innovators. Very, very, very cool. And then Seraphine's just a really good splash unit. Cool. Yeah, again, I don't want to talk too much about units. I have a unit guide, so I need to stop talking about them too much, but cool. All right, Protector shields shield themselves for 6 seconds whenever they cast a spell. This shield does not stack. Okay, cool. So it's just at 2, and then after that, it's 1 unit intervals. You have Blitzcrank, Garen, Cassian, and Scion. Garen, Cassian, and Blitzcrank are going to be your early game units you're playing around. You can play around Mutant. I like to play around Mutant, Twin Shot, and Academy, because you can, when you're playing around Garen and Cassian, you can play Kog'Maw, and you can play Kog'Maw and Graves. What's wrong with me? Kog'Maw and Graves, which are going to be an academic, a mutant, and a twin shot. And if you have like an augment for mutation, then you can boom play around that. It'd be really nice. If not, just splash in a Blitzcrank, or just whenever you hit your mutant, you can splash in the mutant as well. So you can carry like a twin shot for backline. Very good with these guys. Cool. And then you could just transition into a Scion as a main frontliner and play like Scion plus Blitzcrank can be a very solid late game frontline as well if Scion makes sense for your team and all that good stuff. So early game, you just play around mutants, academics, and twin shots. Can be a very good way to play the game. You can also play around scraps with Blitzcrank. Blitzcrank also fits in the Yordle build pretty well. And then if Scion makes sense as a frontline, play around Scion if that makes sense. But typically you don't run Protectors late game unless Scion is your main frontliner. But he's not always going to be your main frontliner if you play this early game. So just be mindful of that. Okay, Scholars. All allies restore some mana every 2 seconds at intervals of 2. So 2, 4, and 6. I love this trait. Very good to splash into every comp. Very easy to fit into every single composition in the game. You got Heimerdinger, Janna, Lissandra, Yuumi, Zyra. And so if you guys heard me talk about earlier, I talked about there's that you can play like a Yordle Syndicate Scholar build. That's with like a TF carry or a Ziggs carry. And you just play around Yordle Syndicates and Scholars. You just play Zyra, Heimerdinger. That can be a very good way to play Scholars in the early game. I love doing that. You can also play Scholars, just like I talked about with Innovators, with Lissandra and Heimerdinger. Love it. And then late game, if you're going to play 2 Scholars, it's going to be Janna and Yuumi are just going to be your best bet. They're so good. Such good units. Pair really well with every single comp, but pair exceptionally well with Arcanist builds. So like higher mana cost builds, Enchanter builds, pairs very well. And you can also play 4 Scholars if you really want to. And 6 Scholars, I've seen people do it, but that's going to be very meta dependent. But I do personally like playing 4 Scholars, and playing like a Lissandra frontline can be very good. And also when you're playing around Urgot, you're playing Bruisers, it's really easy to splash in Lissandra and Janna to get Scholars in that build. So Scholar is a very good splash trait, and specifically very good with Arcanist and Lissandra carry comps in the late game. Cool. All right, Sniper. Okay, Snipers deal bonus damage for each hex between themselves and their target. This is just a copy of set 3, I believe. So it's at intervals of 2, 4, and 6. You got Caitlyn, Jhin, Kog'Maw, Misfortune, Tristana. I already talked about the comps that Caitlyn, running snipers with Bruisers, very good with Caitlyn. That can be a very good thing to do in Kog'Maw and transitioning with, and you can do that with Protectors as well. Very good. Jhin is going to pair well with Orianna. He is a Clockwork. Pair super well with Bodyguards. Jhin needs a lot of stall. So when you play Jhin, you want to pair with Bodyguards and Enchanters, things that give you a lot of stall, but obviously there's niche areas where they pair with something different. You got Misfortune that you can play around as well, which you can play around Mercenaries, and then later on in the game, if you actually want to play her as a carry, you will need stall, just kind of like Jhin, so like Bodyguards, stuff like that is going to be very good for you. And Tristana, you typically just play around her as a carry if you want to play Yordles, or you can just play her as an item holder to get to Jhin, but those are the things you're going to be playing around with each of those champs. All right, cool. Transformer. So Transformers have 2 forms. They can swap in between during planning phase, depending on where they are placed in the front line or back line. So if Jace is front 2 rows, he's hammer form, and if he's in back 2 rows, he is gun form. And I don't know about, there's like a middle row in there, I think, but whatever. You'll see when you do it. Cool. So Jace is an enforcer and an innovator, and then his own unique trait. He is a frontliner, utility, and a DPS. Pretty insane. You just play him however you want. Already talked about Jace in another video. But anyways, pair him with innovators, and you can also just splash him into basically any comp. Very good with Jhin as well, because Jhin does scale with attack speed. You can just pop him in with Jhin. Very, very, very nice. All right, cool. Twin Shot. Whenever a Twin Shot attacks, they have a chance to attack twice. So it's not a bounce. They'll just attack twice. Cool. Twin Shots also gain bonus AD. Cool. So it's at 2, 4, and 6, and these are percent chances right here, and this is just attack damage that you gain per synergy. Cool. You have Gangplank, Graves, Jinx, Kog'Maw, and Urgot. So if you want to play in the late game with Jinx or Urgot, you're playing around Bruisers and Chemtechs typically, and Vi and all that good stuff. And Jace is very good to splash in there. So like I already talked about, early game you're playing around Graves. You're typically going to be playing around Protectors like Garen and Cassian and Kog'Maw, and you can just kind of flex into Mutant or figure out what you want to do from there. And then if you're playing GP prints you money, so you're just going to play around Mercenaries and Twin Shots typically if you're going to be doing that. Cool. All right, Origins Academy. Academics have bonus attack damage and ability power and can learn from their allies, increasing this bonus whenever an ally casts an ability. So you start out with a base amount of bonuses, and then it can scale up throughout the fight per cast from other academics, and it's at intervals of 2, 4, 6, and 8. So like I already said, in the early game you can play around Protectors and Twin Shots. If you're playing around Katarina, you can play, or you're just playing Sins, basically. You're playing Sins, and you can eventually pair that with Bodyguards, because Bodyguards are going to be very good for you, especially when you start to transition to like a Kali and Shaco. So when you end up playing a Katarina build, you typically will end up starting to play around Bodyguards later on in the game, but mostly you're just playing around Sins, obviously subject to balance change. Leona. So you have Bodyguards in here. Bodyguards in here are going to be very good with challengers, because Yone is a challenger. He's the big carry of this one. Very good with Arcanist, because Lux is the other big carry. And then Yuumi is a splashable unit that fits into every comp. So you just play academics when it makes sense for you to carry them, like Arcanist if you're carrying Lux, like Challenger if you're playing Yone. And then in the early game around Graves and Garen, and then with Bodyguards and Assassins if you're carrying Katarina. So just play it where it makes sense, and you can splash it in with Yuumi and Leona pretty easily, but they don't really benefit themselves very well. So it's better if you're going to be playing around an actual carry. Cool. If you want to like think about academics. Typically, you don't think about academics unless you're carrying one of the academics. All right. Chemtech. After dropping below a certain health threshold, Chemtech champions gain a bunch of stats, 25% damage reduction, 50% attack speed, and regenerate 4% of their maximum health each second, subject to balance change at intervals of 3, 5, 7, and 9. Very cool. So you got Mundo, Lysandra, Singed, Twitch, Urgot, Victor, Warwick, and Zach. So like I said in the early game, if you want to play around Warwick, I like playing around Warwick, then you can play around that innovator tech that I was talking about earlier. Cool. If you're playing a Lysandra carry, you can play around Zach and Mundo, or just like not even care about your Chemtechs, honestly. And then Singed, like I talked about, you're playing that innovator tech with the challengers, with the Warwick. I really like in the early game. I like that a lot. So I think they pair very well together, innovators in the early game. And then late game, you're typically, unless you're going to be playing this whole Chemtech build, then you're typically just going to be playing around Urgot with Bruisers plus Lysandra, and then you can maybe flex to a Victor carry with that. But whenever you play Victor carry, you can start playing other stuff like more enchanters and things like that, and kind of transition out of Urgot. But your most consistent way to play this comp is going to be with an Urgot carry, and you're playing around Bruisers plus a Lysandra plus Scholar plus random splash units with a Jinx as your side carry, and then you can add a Victor whenever you want, and play 5, 7, or 9 Chemtechs whenever it makes sense. Cool, but those are some of the best pairings there. Clockwork is a very good splash synergy trait that you can play in every single build. Very, very, very nice. Anytime it's meta, it's going to be good to splash into most builds. Okay, all allies have increased attack speed and additional attack speed for each Hextech augment you own. So you'll always own 3 at the end of the game, so it scales throughout the game. This is obviously subject to balance changes at intervals of 2, 4, and 6. The only way you can get 6 is with an augment bonus. But you have Camille, Jhin, Orianna, and Zilean. Like I said before, in the early game, I really like to play around Camille and Zilean with innovators, challengers, and Chemtechs. I really like playing around that. They'd be a very good way to play Clockworks in the early game. Or if you get the augment where you get an additional Clockwork, you can just play around challengers with Camille, get it for free, or innovators without Camille, and just play Zilean and get it for free. Late game, you have Jhin and Orianna. So anytime you're playing a Jhin carry comp, you're always going to have Orianna in the build. Orianna fits in almost every single build in the game, so you'll get the value from that naturally. And if you have an augment, you can just splash in a Zilean to get the 4. Clockwork can be very strong given balance changes. Also as well, you may want to consider every single game just splashing in a Jhin. A naked Jhin with no items can deal some decent damage, and if the attack speed is very important to your build, like when you're playing Urgot carry or Kaisa or something like that, and if you can fit it in, playing 2 Clockwork can be just a very good splashable synergy. If you just want to throw in a Jhin and an Orianna, it can be very good. Okay, Cuddly. This is very specific to Yuumi. So Yuumi attaches herself to her nearest ally at the start of combat, or the lowest health ally. So it's a 50-50 chance. Lowest health ally after being unattached for 3 seconds. And this is at the beginning of combat as well. Attaching grants the ally a shield equal to 30% of Yuumi's maximum health, and Yuumi detaches if the shield is broken. While attached, Yuumi, I can't read, guys. While attached, Yuumi is untargetable and can't attack, but gains 5 mana per second and 5 mana whenever an ally attacks, subject to balance change. I believe it's 10 right now when an ally attacks. So anyways, so it's just Yuumi. Obviously, Yuumi is just a splash unit. You can play every game. She's a legendary. Very, 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 very good unit. Very good in scholar builds, very good in academic builds, obviously. But basically, you just splash her into every build. I talked about Yuumi in my unit guide video, but you can just put this next to your frontliner for it to latch on your frontliner, give you that shield value. It can be very, very, very nice. And one thing to note, but it is a 50-50 chance between them and your lowest health ally. Important thing to note that she can attach to a target dummy. So there are some negative synergies effects, because if she attaches to a target dummy, they do not attack. So she'll have really, really, really slow mana gain. So just be careful taking target dummies and playing around Yuumi. Just know that you might self-nerf yourself later in the game. That doesn't mean don't take target dummy, but just be mindful of it. One other thing, some secret tech. I mean, not so secret tech actually. Put a Warmogs on your Yuumi, and as it does, it's 30% of Yuumi's maximum health. So if you get 2-star Yuumi with Warmogs, you're basically giving your whole team a Warmogs, because everyone she's attached to, you're giving them a Warmog shield. It's really insane to stack health items on her. I love it. All right, cool. Enforcers. Enforcers detain enemies at the start of combat for 4 seconds. I think it's 5 right now, actually. Temporarily removing them from combat. So they're just like CC'd, kind of like a Zephyr. Cool, at 2. And it's a certain health threshold. If they take a certain amount of damage, it will break, at least at the time we make this video. It's at intervals of 2 and 4. The enemy who has the most health is the one that's going to be CC'd. And then at 4, the enemy who dealt the most damage last combat. So we'll actually do both. At least at the time of making this video, they may change this a lot, so just bear with me. But anyways, this can be insane because it'll always CC at 4 their most valuable unit. So this can be really good to splash in, especially with augments. It's really hard to fit without augments, but if you can get the augments, it is really nice to splash this in if you can get the the 2 trait Enforcer augment. Okay, early game, like I said before, you can play around Caitlyn and Bruisers. Very, 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 very great. I love playing around that. Can be very nice. And in the late game, you can play like a Jace Vi plus Jinx if you're playing like Bruiser, Jinx, twin shots. And then also it's very easy when you're playing Fiora to splash a Jace in there, or if you're playing Innovator Challengers, then you already have Jace in there, obviously. So playing Fiora with Jace can be very nice. Or again, if you have the augment, it's really easy to splash 2 in, can be very, very, very powerful. Okay, Glutton. Once per planning phase, this is very cool. You can feed a unit to Thomas Kinch. This unit is consumed, granting permanent stats. The more valuable the unit, the bigger the bonus. To feed Thomas Kinch, hover a unit over him until his mouth opens, then release. So you just got to dangle it over there. He'll open his mouth and he'll slurp it right up. Okay, so, and he gains stats based on what they are. So if they're an aggressive type unit, like a Challenger, an Arcanist, or something like that, he'll always gain AP. And then if they're an Enchanter, he'll gain Magic Resist. And if they are a Bodyguard, he'll gain armor. And then any other tank stats like Bruisers and stuff like that, he'll gain health. So you just basically just give him stats. I talked about this in my unit guide video. Just be careful when you're playing Thomas Kinch that you don't, you don't want to feed him when you still don't have your board upgrades. Like, you don't want to feed him expensive stuff when you really, there's some critical upgrades you need. So just be careful with that. So Tom is going to be, he's a splashable unit that you can just toss in if you get a 2-star Tom. It can be very good. It's very good CC. But obviously, this is going to be very good in Bruiser, Twin Shot, Jinx Focus Comps, Chemtech Comps. He's going to fit in there very nicely. Okay, Imperial. At the start of combat, the Imperial who dealt the most damage last combat becomes a Tyrant. The Tyrant deals bonus damage. When the Tyrant dies, the Imperial who has dealt the most damage this combat becomes a Tyrant. So it's based off of last combat. You gain somebody who your highest DPS should always get the thing, but it is based on your previous combat, so it can flip every now and then if you get CC'd. Okay, so it's a 3 and 5 unit synergy. The reason why I don't like playing this, it's a 3 unit synergy, and 3 of these units have 0 utility. Only 1 of these units have utility and can fit into other comps. That's Scion. So that's why I personally don't like playing around Imperials unless I have augments. Very good with augments. But I mean, if you're playing Samira, you're going to be playing around Challengers, and you're going to be playing Scion as your frontliner with some protectors. If you're playing around Swain, you're going to be playing around Arcanist and Scion as your frontliner if you want to carry a Swain or something like that. And if you're playing Talon, you're going to be playing around Sins and Scion. Pretty simple, yeah. This comp is very good if you want to like duo carry, because again, like I said, there's just so many carry. If you don't have Imperial, if you don't have an Imperial emblem, you really need like the duo carry or figure something out. That's why I don't like Imperials, but obviously subject to balance change. But they just kind of like work with themselves. They don't really pair very well with other comps, except for like the unit, the synergies specifically on the units. Okay, Mercenaries. So you gain a treasure chest that opens when you win combat against a player. At the start of each planning phase, roll the dice to add more loot to the chest. The longer you've gone without opening the chest, the luckier the dice gets. This is just fortune from step 4. So yeah, if you win, you cash out. If you lose, things get added to your chest, and you can actually see what was added into there, so you know what your cash out's going to be. Very cool. So it's at 3 and 5 intervals. If you want to just play Mercenaries, you play around Mercenaries, and your carry is, you can play carry Gangplank, Misfortune, Gwen, and then obviously Tom Kinch is a great unit for late game. Cool deal. Typically, you want to play around this if you have like a mercenary emblem. It's really easy to play around this, or if you just hit your mercenaries early and you can re-roll a Gangplank, play around twin shots, maybe get some augments for that. You can play around Misfortune. I'm sure there'll be a patch where she is meta. I mean, she just got buffed and she was okay on last patch. So I'm sure there'll be a patch. You can play around snipers, and you can just run bruiser front lines. And like the thing is, you can always just pivot out, because snipers need a lot of time to buy. You need to buy time for them. So like you could play Alawi mid game and then transition into like a Bodyguard Enchanter build with a Jhin and Clockwork. So you're just not locked into Mercenaries. Mercenaries kind of like work in their own build, and you just add synergies based off of that, and then you pivot out. But if you want to run Mercenaries the whole game, you just run your Mercenaries and just play Legendaries, plus all the crazy stuff you're going to get from your Mercenary table. So don't think too hard about playing Mercenaries. Just play them to get Econ. If you're going to play them the whole game, then you're playing Mercenaries, and whoever you're stacking items on, just add synergies based off of that. Okay, Mutations. Okay, mutants gain unique bonuses. These are different each game. Guys, I'm not going to talk about the whole mutation table. That is like 5 synergies of its own. But basically, there's like good ones for Kog'Maw. There's good ones for Malzahar. There's good ones for Cho'gath. There's good ones for Mundo. There's good ones for all of them. And it's just play based off of your game. I will talk about how to carry each of these or like who they pair well with. So as I said before, Bruisers pair really well with Twin Shots and other mutants, obviously. So we got Mundo, Cho'gath, and then like you can pair that with Chemtech, with Mundo and Zac, and Twin Shots with Urgot and Jinx, and you get Vi, and you can get Sister, and then you can get Enforcer and all that good stuff. So like I've already talked about, playing Kai'Sa obviously pairs very well with mutants, so pairs are going to pair well with Bruisers, and Chemtech are going to be easy to play around. And usually whenever you want to play Kai'Sa, you're open to playing Jinx or Kai'Sa, very flexible items, or Urgot as a carry, all have very flexible items. Okay, cool. Cassian, I've already talked about him. Kog'Maw, already talked about him a lot. And then Malzahar, you can play with Arcanist, mutants. He has some really interesting mutations that work really well for him. There's a mana cutting one, and there's a mana cutting one, and there's an execute one, very strong on Malzahar. So if you get those ones, you can play around that. And yeah, you just play around Arcanist and your Bruisers because you're playing around mutants. And then maybe if you want to pivot out later to just play 3 mutants, if you get like a mutant emblem, they can play boards that have better stall because he does need a little bit time to ramp up to deal damage. You can play like Bodyguards, Enchanters, that sort of thing. Okay, scrap. At the start of combat, a number of incomplete components on a scrap unit turns into a ephemeral full item for combat. So if you have so basically what you need to know, if you have a component on somebody, based off of which level you have it on, it can turn into a full item. So it can turn into a full item. Additionally, at the start of combat, scraps gain a shield, or scraps also gain a health shield for each item equipped in your army. This includes completed items. Cool. It's like all components completed items. All right, so it's at intervals of 2, 4, and 6, at least right now. You got Blitzcrank, Echo, Ezreal, Janna, Jinx, Trundle, and Ziggs. This is primarily an early and mid-game synergy, very strongly early and mid-game. It can be very hard to play around 6. I'm sure there'll be a patch where that's very strong, but it's very difficult to play around it because you just want to complete items later on in the game. And if you try to get 6 and then try to pivot out, you can get so dizzy, so it's hard to play. So in the early game, it's really good to play scraps, like play scraps, Yordles, like with Blitzcrank in there. If you're playing an Ezreal carry comp, you can play around innovators and scraps, and or you can just play 4 scraps, right? You can play around Bruisers with an Ezreal, that sort of thing. You're playing like a Trundle carry, can be very cool. Basically, this is either like you're playing 4 or you're going to be playing 2 with another comp. It's typically how you play it. And then if you can fit in 4 from the mid game, very strong. When you're playing scraps, you need to make sure you're utilizing the synergy and getting your maximum value on wherever you're at in the synergy 2, 4, 6. You need to be getting maximum value all the time because these units don't naturally have anything to do with each other than that they do that for the most part. And then late game, you can just splash in like Jinx and Janna. Like you don't have to have 4 scrap. You can have Jinx and Janna and then get value on one of them. Can be a very good way to play scrap. Cool. Sister. Okay, sisters are unique to Jinx and Vi because they are sisters. Sisters are empowered by trying to one-up each other. Vi's ability range increases 2 hexes, and Jinx gains stacking attack speed for 3 seconds on takedown. Very powerful in both of them. If you're playing a Vi carry comp, like let's say you reroll Vi, then it's going to be very good to add Jinx. If you're playing Jinx, it's very good to add Vi if you can fit her. That's all you need to know. Because they just fit in the comps that I said that they fit in earlier. That's all you really need to know. Very strong. Okay, Socialite. Socialite reveal a spotlight on the battlefield. The unit standing in the spotlight at the start of combat gains unique bonuses at 1, 2, and 3. Cool. You guys can read that for yourself if you'd like. You have Galio, Seraphine, and Taric, and then there's also tons of augments that give you Socialite stuff. Very cool. This is going to be splashable every game that you can fit into any comp, pretty much, except for vertical synergies. And you just fit these in when the Socialite Hex makes sense for your comp. So if it's on the front line and you're playing like Assassins or a Scion carry or like a Yone or Fiora carry, then that makes a lot of sense to play Socialites. If it's on the back line and you're playing like Arcanist or Jin or something like that, then obviously it makes a lot of sense to play Socialites in that spot, and you can splash them in if it makes sense. Or if you're playing like around Bodyguards and you want to play Galio, then you can then try to fit them in. It can make a lot of sense there. Cool, very splashable. Syndicates, chosen allies are cloaked in shadows, gaining 30% Omnivamp and 50 armor and 50 magic resist. So it's currently the Syndicate champion with the lowest current health, and it bounces throughout the fight. So it's not on, it's just whoever has the lowest current health. At 3, 5, and 7, and at 5, it's all champions. At 7, it's all allies. Very powerful at 7 if it fits, if you get like the augments where you get extra syndicates. Very powerful. Every single time I've gotten it on PBE, I first placed. Cool. Obviously pairs super well with Sins and Bodyguards, as there are 2 Bodyguards and there are 2 Sins. Fits with Arcanist and Scholars, because Arcanists fit very well with Scholars. If you're playing a TF carry, I love playing TF carry if TF is ever meta. Very easy to play around in the early game with Yordles, Bodyguards, and Scholars, like I talked about earlier. And then late game, you can, if you're playing Sins, you can play Braum Darius, or if you're playing a bunch of Arcanists, you can play Braum TF. I guess you can play Darius, but you know, it's better if you can just get this. Or you play Braum TF, like Braum TF Leona, and then you fit in a Zyra for a Scholar. Can be very cool. So around Arcanist, Sins, and Yordles in the early game can be very good. Okay, Yordles. After combat with a player, a random free Yordle appears on your bench. So this is an econ trait. So at 3, you start to get the random Yordles appearing on your bench. This is a lot like Draconic. Very good in the early game. Very good way to generate econ, and very good way to hit 3 stars. But it's balanced around like these units are not as strong because you're able to star them up really easily. At 6, Yordle's mana costs are reduced by a certain percentage, subject to balance change. You got Heimerdinger, Lulu, Poppy, Tristana, Vex, and Ziggs. You can play either Tristana carry or Ziggs carry in the early game typically. Like I said, I really like playing them around syndicates with TF, and maybe I carry the TF instead, and you just play 3 Yordles. Or you can play Tristana, you can play 3 Yordles with like Bodyguards and snipers, and just like transition that into like a Jin comp or something like that. Or legendary something. Or you can play 6 Yordles and you can carry any of the following. You can carry Ziggs, Tristana, or Heimerdinger. All are the carries of this comp. And then some of the Lulu is a great utility unit. They pair really well with Janna and Blitzcrank. So Blitzcrank is a very good pairing if you don't know. And then once you level up from Blitzcrank, you can add in a Janna and maybe a Bodyguard like a Braum or something like that. Very good pairing. Or like a Janna, Orianna, and Jin, like hyper late game if you're playing this, can be very, very, very good. I really like those pairings with those. All right, guys, that is it. That is a 40-minute video. I tried to go through that as quick as I could because I know these are so long, but the set is so complicated. Guys, if you made it all the way to this point in the video, I appreciate you. I was trying to be in the zone getting through this stuff, but I appreciate you guys so much. And if you learned something from this and you made it all the way to this point in this video, I would appreciate if you left a comment below. I love reading that shit. It gets me going. It just gets me hyped up and motivated to make more videos and the stream and stuff like that. And it just fills my heart, honestly. It makes me feel good. So I do appreciate when you guys do that. And, you know, it does help me on the YouTube algorithm and engagement. So if you want to help me out, that is great there too. Guys, I stream on twitch.tv/TrajanTFT that you've been seeing on the screen the whole time. I'll leave a link in the comments, and there's always a link in my description. If you guys want to check that out. It's a lot more fun, still educational focused, but a lot of fun over there. We have a great time, and I'd love to see you there. But if not, if you're just here, that'd be great. That's fine. I also have a Twitter, guys, that I post all the time, and none of you guys follow me there. You don't have to, obviously, but a lot of times I'm just putting things out into the ether, and I would love to engage more with you guys, and yeah, and that would help my dopamine, my dopamine receptors. Help them out. Okay, guys, that's gonna be it. I hope you're doing well, and hope you guys have a good day and a good night, and wherever you are, I just hope you're happy and healthy. Yeah, I'll see you guys later. Bye.